Next on Link TV, Latin Pulse, news and analysis from Latin America as seen by Latin American media, followed by a panel discussion on the issues. Next on Latin Pulse, only on Link TV.
The following program is an original production of Link TV.
It's a region long considered neglected by U.S. foreign policy. At a time when Latin America is shifting to the political left, it's now regained the focus of U.S. security officials. Is this a strategic move or just a way to maintain dominance over what's been called America's backyard? This and more coming up next on Latin Pulse. Hello and welcome to Pulso Latino. I'm your host, Ena Cuevas. Our topic tonight, U.S. security and the role of Latin America.
El crimen organizado puede llegar a ser un peligro mayor que el comunismo para Estados Unidos. El narcotráfico, ¿verdad? El lavado de dinero, etc.
For decades, the U.S. has maintained tight security agreements with Latin America's military and police forces. To some, it's been the traditional way of keeping the region in check. For others, it's a way to fight terrorism and organized crime. The latest version is known as Plan Mérida, a $1.6 billion plan approved by the U.S. Congress and signed into law by President Bush in June. This three-year plan will help train Army and police forces in Mexico and Central America to fight terrorism and drug traffic. Venezuela's Telesur has this story.
La Cámara de Representantes de Estados Unidos aprobó otra versión de la llamada Iniciativa Mérida, que otorgaría al gobierno mexicano recursos por $1.600 millones para apoyar la lucha contra el crimen organizado durante 3 años.
No nos podemos dejar de ninguna manera presionar por los Estados Unidos a cambio de unos recursos.
Después de las protestas del Congreso mexicano ante los legisladores estadounidenses en la pasada reunión interparlamentaria, fueron retiradas algunas de las condiciones que pretendían imponerse. Ya no exige al gobierno de México cambios legales para mejorar la impartición de justicia, además de que incrementa los fondos para combatir el tráfico de armas estadounidenses en la frontera común. Según los congresistas de Estados Unidos, el nuevo proyecto, que autoriza la entrega de helicópteros, equipos de radar y tecnología para la intercepción de drogas, respeta la soberanía de México. Sin embargo, aún no queda claro si se trata solo de maquillaje a la iniciativa original.
No permitiremos ninguna acción injerencista de parte de ellos en nuestra política nacional.
México rechaza la supervisión del Departamento de Estado norteamericano sobre unidades particulares de policías y militares mexicanos, como aún pretende Estados Unidos.
Last month in Mexico, U.S. presidential candidate John McCain was asked by Mexico's Galavisión about Plan Mérida. He said if the U.S. wasn't such a huge market for drugs, Plan Mérida wouldn't be necessary.
The Mérida agreement, I think the Mérida agreement, I'm sorry, my pronunciation, the Mérida agreement is one that I think is a landmark agreement between our two countries. And the American Congress and people have pledged nearly $500 million initially to help and work with the government of Mexico. Times are tough on the border. We've seen these terrible people cutting off people's heads. And we know that part of the problem is the demand for drugs in the United States of America. We in America must do a better job of talking to our children and our fellow citizens about how terrible drugs are. And we have to work on the demand side. But also we need to work very closely with Mexico to try to stop that flow as best we can.
The U.S. recently closed the School of the Americas in Georgia. This is where Latin American military officers would learn about military and police tactics. Many accused the school of being a training ground for military dictatorships on the use of torture tactics. Now, the same accusations are being leveled against ILEA. That's the regional police training facility being built in El Salvador by the U.S. government. Its purpose is to help fight drug trafficking and organized crime.
El organizado puede llegar a ser un peligro mayor que el comunismo para Estados Unidos. El narcotráfico, ¿verdad? El lavado de dinero, etc.
Costa Rica had been designated as the location. Once for political reasons, it didn't come to fruition, and so we frantically started to look for a place to house the idea.
Porque en este país no había ni fuerza política en el Congreso, ni fuerza social en la calle, capaz de hacer oposición, como en Costa Rica, para evitar de que se instalara acá. Así de fácil.
We had Peru as a candidate, we had Ecuador, Panama, and El Salvador. And during our travels, El Salvador was the one who really brought us, gave us more of themselves, and were open for the idea.
Básicamente quizás comentarle que ILEA San Salvador es una ILEA como todas las otras del mundo, con altos contenidos técnicos, con muchas capacidades de instructores que permiten a todos los beneficiarios, en este caso los países latinoamericanos y del Caribe, desarrollarse de mejor manera, tener mejores capacidades para los aplicadores de la ley, y obviamente esto contribuye totalmente a la democracia de nuestros países.
Y que a final de cuentas, en el marco de un mundo como el actual, que no es el de hace 20, 25, 30 años, con crimen transnacional, con crimen organizado, con instituciones, muchas de ellas secuestradas por mafias, ¿verdad? Se requiere de alguna manera profesionalizar lo más posible las instituciones para que se combata el crimen.
The main accusation against these U.S. training facilities is that Latin American police and military forces learn repressive tactics. This helps repressive governments friendly to the U.S. remain in power. The following video was shot during training exercises in Mexico. It shows recruits being abused by their trainers, some of whom were speaking English. Mexico's Galavisión reports this incident is raising eyebrows on both sides of the border.
A manera de sanción, el instructor ordena, en inglés, que ruede sobre su propio vómito.
Alto.
Now we can stop the drill.
Ok, ya se acabó el ejercicio para ti.
En otra fase del adiestramiento, otro policía, a quien llaman Nánchez, con los ojos vendados y maniatado, es presionado para que revele información.
No necesitas, güey. No necesitas, cabrón. Eres bien pendejo, güey. Meter la cabeza un hoyo de mierda con ratas, estás bien pendejo.
Durante el ejercicio, el policía municipal es torturado física y psicológicamente. Aparentemente, los instructores le echan agua por la nariz.
Currently, the U.S. has military personnel deployed in 150 countries around the world. But Ecuador's President Rafael Correa plans to close an American base in the city of Manta that conducts drug trafficking surveillance. This has triggered anger in neighboring Peru because many fear the U.S. military may move its operations to their country.
Algunos alegaban por el alza de los precios de los alimentos y otros contra Estados Unidos por las supuestas intenciones de Washington de construir una base para el control del narcotráfico en territorio peruano.
Pero también es un paro de repudio a la presencia de las tropas norteamericanas, porque no podemos permitir que se violente nuestra soberanía nacional con el cuento de acciones humanitarias.
Adding to the concern are the recent military maneuvers in Peru between U.S. and Peruvian forces. Here's the report from regional broadcaster Telesur.
Esta filmación confirma los entrenamientos que vienen recibiendo militares peruanos por parte de oficiales norteamericanos. Lo que aún no se confirma, pero tiene cada vez más indicios, es la instalación de una base militar estadounidense en el país como parte del Plan Colombia.
Esto de que es un teatro de descanso para las FARC sería el elemento que estaría cambiando para ir generando las condiciones que justifiquen la presencia de un centro de coordinación antinarcóticos. Mi temor es que esto sirva también para involucrarse progresivamente en el conflicto armado colombiano.
La denuncia de Soberón se basa en una serie de operaciones que vienen realizando tropas de ambos países.
Y ellos necesitan una base militar en la región para, primero, monitorear el avance del Plan Colombia, pero desde el otro lado, ¿no?, el combate con las FARC, ver cómo se van desenvolviendo los gobiernos de Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, el mismo Brasil, Y por último, para tener un control directo de lo que es una zona estratégica en el mundo, que es la Amazonía.
El gobierno ha negado la instalación de una base, pero hoy tiene la visita de un alto mando militar norteamericano para conversar sobre la lucha antinarcóticos. Verónica Insausti, Telesur Lima.
The possibility that the U.S. may establish a military presence in Peru has also triggered the anger of Bolivia's President Evo Morales. He says the presence of foreign military in a Latin American country is of regional concern. But Peru's president disagrees, and as Chile Tele 13 reports, he's asking the Bolivian leader to butt out.
Evo Morales está en el ojo del huracán, tras el impasse diplomático que vive por estos días con el presidente peruano Alan García, quien hoy hasta lo mandó a guardar silencio, tras asegurar que Estados Unidos posee una base militar en territorio peruano.
Que venga ese señor Morales dentro del Perú y que me diga dónde está la base, pero lo mejor que podría hacer es no meterse en política peruana, ni estar dividiendo a los peruanos o estar queriendo enfrentar peruanos con peruanos. Ya suficiente parece haber hecho en Bolivia como para venir a meterse aquí.
Lamento mucho que presidentes pueden mandar a callar a un presidente. Ahora, el tema de las bases militares ya no es un problema interno, es un problema de la región, no es un problema de un país.
The government of Ecuador, a big ally of Venezuela's Hugo Chavez, is plagued by accusations that some of its officials are CIA operatives. This has led Ecuador's president to fire his own defense minister, accused of being on the CIA's payroll. That story from Spain's Televisión Española.
Rafael Correa ha elegido a este hombre como nuevo titular de defensa. Se trata de Javier Ponce, un periodista que hasta ahora trabajaba como su secretario personal. Estos días Correa está sumido en un enfrentamiento con el ejército, al que acusa de deslealtad por haber informado a Colombia antes que a él mismo de que Ecuador mantenía contactos con las FARC. Dice que han actuado controlados por Estados Unidos.
Latin America is moving toward political and economic integration, similar to that of the European Union. At a recent meeting in Brazil, 12 Latin American countries signed a treaty to create UNASUR, the Union of South American Countries. One of the initiatives of UNASUR is the creation of a single market. And to counter U.S. military influence in the region, Venezuela and Brazil also proposed a South American Defense Council. It would draft defense policy and serve as a mechanism for regional security. We have this report from Bolivia's ATV Noticias.
La primera resolución del flamante organismo fue la designación de un grupo de trabajo que presente una propuesta para la creación de un Consejo de Defensa Regional promovido por el presidente brasilero Luis Ignacio Lula da Silva.
Determiné a mi ministro de Defensa que realizara consultas con todos los países de Sudamérica sobre la constitución de un Consejo Sudamericano de Defensa.
El organismo pretende impulsar la integración de la región a pesar de los fuertes conflictos diplomáticos que existen entre países vecinos y a los que el presidente colombiano Álvaro Uribe ha hecho eco pidiendo a los miembros de UNASUR que clasifiquen como terroristas a todos los grupos violentos que atenten contra la democracia en el continente.
In our studios to talk about U.S. security and what part Latin America plays in it, we have Ted Lewis from Global Exchange. And from Washington, D.C., we're joined by Geoff Thale from the Washington Office on Latin America. First of all, welcome both to Latin Pulse, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Lewis, why was there so much opposition in Mexico to Plan Mérida?
I think that many Mexicans see that in order to have something like Plan Mérida come in, you really have to practice amnesia, because we know that in the 1990s there was clear evidence, and the New York Times did Pulitzer Prize-winning series on the issue of corruption all the way to the top levels of the Mexican military. There has not been any thoroughgoing reform. The elections of 2000 did bring in a different party to the country, but there has not been any kind of reform within the military that would give the kind of confidence that you'd need to think that this institution had really changed.
But doesn't that support then the idea of actually bringing money and trying to train these troops, trying to change them, trying to teach them something on how they can better fight the drug trafficking?
Well, if we thought that was really going to be the practice, that would be, you know, it sounds good, right? It sounds good what you're saying, but I think the reason that I'm concerned, and I think that so many Mexicans are concerned, is that there's not any transparency about this. We don't know exactly how that training is going to take place. And at the end of the day, we know that this is an institution that is very hermetic, and that, you know, for all the $1.4 billion of aid that's going in, that still remains a relatively small part of the Mexican military budget. And this is not the kind of practices that we think should go on. If you really want to deal honestly with the narco problem, you've got to look at U.S. consumption. You've got to look at consumption in Mexico as well, which is a growing issue. And within Plan Mexico, there's not a cent that goes for rehabilitation of addicts.
Mr. Thale, what about Mr. Calderon's efforts along the U.S.-Mexico border to try and curtail some of the drug trafficking? The violence in the area has increased tremendously. How is he doing?
I agree with Ted. There are pretty serious problems with the Mexican armed forces. I think we ought to see a much more serious emphasis on strengthening the institutions of the Mexican justice system, the police, the attorney general, the prison system, as a way of helping Mexico deal with that part of the problem.
But that hasn't been the push from the United States. The push has been to actually continue training these forces, train the police forces within the country in order for them to be able to fight the problem. However, that is still being seen as controversial.
Right. The fundamental emphasis in Plan Merida, at least on the Mexican side, and in the first year, is aid to the Mexican military. And there is some aid for institution building, judicial reform, human rights training, police reform, but it's less than 20% of the package. And I think our view is that a better package would put a lot more money into that in the long term, and a lot less money into the Mexican military, and complement that with what we need to do here in the United States.
Mr. Lewis, what do you think about the training that the United States is conducting of the police forces in Latin America, the push that there is to help them be able to fight their own internal problems?
It's important to recognize that the United States has not really ever engaged in a serious evaluation of our policies of support for dictatorships throughout these decades. It's as if nobody remembers. We act as though these things had never happened, and people in Latin America who were affected by these policies, and friends of mine who, you know, died going to their jobs by, you know, attacked by thugs who were sponsored by the United States. These are not so easily forgotten. So there's a suspicion, and in addition to that, you have a changing strategic situation in Latin America, partly driven by the fact that people don't trust the motives of the United States in the region. So as countries are able to sort of escape the U.S. orbit, you've seen a very strong counterpole to the United States growing in Latin America. And so it would appear that the United States is trying to hold on to some of the few countries that it has left that have institutions right through the political and military institutions that are completely aligned with U.S. policy. So they're trying to strengthen those areas to maintain a handful of allies. But the truth is that the larger strategic picture in Latin America is one of growing independence for those countries. And that's what the United States is really up against. So I don't really believe that the motives behind U.S. policy are as clean and as clear as they're presented.
But Mr. Thale, isn't it better to have the United States do the training, focus on the human rights, and try and get these police forces up to a level that would be satisfactory instead of what used to happen in the past? Isn't it better for the U.S. to participate that way?
Well, yeah, I probably have a slightly different take on this than Ted does. I mean, it's clear that the strategic situation in the region has changed. I think if you ask what are the major concerns of people in the region and what ought the United States be doing in response to that, the first concern is poverty and inequality, and the second one is crime and insecurity. And the danger in Latin America is that the temptation is to respond to crime and insecurity with militarized policing, with mano dura policies, with lock them up and throw away the key kind of approaches. If the United States can be helpful to Latin American governments and Latin American civil societies in training and developing modern professional civilian police forces in the context of larger responses to crime and insecurity, that's probably a good thing. I think Ted is right to argue that there's real problems in U.S. history with this, and that's why U.S. police training needs to be transparent. There needs to be oversight from Latin American civil society groups of it, and there needs to be guarantees that it's done by civilians and not either by or for the military. I think those ought to be the emphasis. Within that emphasis, if the United States can offer constructive training, I think that's probably a good thing to do.
But that is what the ILEA is arguing in El Salvador, is that they are transparent, that they are doing training for police and not for the military, and that it is not a school of the Americas. However, there are some who believe that that is still a way for the United States to maintain control and continue the same, business as usual.
And they haven't released the curriculum and those sorts of things for the schools, so these create problems.
I don't think it meets the standards for transparency or accountability and oversight or the guarantees of civilian control. I think that the challenge ought to be to try and push it to live up to those standards rather than to shut it down. And in defense terms, the reality is I'm afraid the U.S. military is going to continue to see drug interdiction and drug eradication in the region as the central strategic problem, and one that U.S. military resources are directed to.
Because it seems, Mr. Lewis, that most of the problems coming from Latin America have to do with crime and drugs versus terrorism as it is in the Middle East, as far as the threat from Latin America.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I don't know what the Southern Command is thinking in terms of oil resources and that sort of thing. You often hear, the idea coming from places like Venezuela that the United States covets the oil supplies. I don't think that's a real issue, and I think that the United States is unlikely to engage in any kind of serious military actions in the region other than the ones that you're talking about. I do think that it's important that, as Geoff said, that we really monitor the kinds of signals that are coming from militaries in the region as well as from the United States to the region, because it's important to note that the United States' tendency to try and support military coups has not ended. Even during the current administration, there was a full green light given to the 2002 coup against Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, which has had very negative repercussions. It was the first time that all the countries in Latin America lined up very clearly and very quickly to oppose a coup, and that was pivotal in pushing it back. But the one country that was out of step there and was giving the green light to it was the United States.
Mr. Thale, do you see a difference in the new administration coming into the United States, the McCain administration versus Obama?
Well, I think there's pretty clear differences in tone between a McCain administration and an Obama administration in terms of, it's pretty clear a McCain administration toward Latin America would continue the current policy. Plan Colombia, an emphasis on free trade, maintenance of our current kind of pattern of relationships, isolation of Cuba. I think an Obama administration has indicated that on Cuba and Venezuela both, it would probably take a somewhat less confrontational approach and pursue dialogue more than confrontation. I think Obama has talked about re-examining our trade policy and trade agreements. How far those differences will really go, I think, is not yet clear, but I think he's talked about some differences. If I could just jump back to one point Ted made. I think it's right that you were asking about. I think it's right that the real threats in the region, the security issues for the United States, have to do with immigration, have to do with drug trafficking, have to do with health and environment issues and things like that. They're social challenges. They're not traditional military challenges. And one of the big questions is, will the United States give the authority and the lead role to respond to these to civilian institutions here and there, or will it, because these are defined as security problems, let the Southern Command of the U.S. Or the U.S. military and their Latin American counterparts take the lead in responding? And I think that's a big challenge and a big threat.
Well, thank you very much, both of you, for being with us today. Ted Lewis from Global Exchange here in San Francisco, and in Washington, D.C., Geoff Thale from the Washington Office on Latin America. I also want to thank you at home, or if you're joining us on the web, for being with us today. Also, thanks go out to American University in Washington, D.C. and the University of Miami in Miami, Florida for their support in the production of this program. Join us next time when we take a closer look at Latin America through the eyes of Latin American media. For more information about Pulso Latino and Latin America, just log on to linktv.org. I'm Mena Cuevas. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time here on Latin Pulse.
Latin Pulse was made possible by support from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation and the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Pulso Latino es posible gracias al apoyo de John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation y el William and Flora Hewlett Foundation.
This program is brought to you by Link TV for educational and non-commercial use only. Link TV is the only U.S. network dedicated to global and national news, uncompromising documentaries, and diverse cultural programs. Programs that connect you to the world.